there's a bigger question that I need to deal with, is why should I, which is to say you, why should you care about this? Why is this important? And the basic argument that I'm making is that this is part of the ebb and flow of American business, and in fact global business organization. And what we are seeing here is part of the restructuring. Part of a restructuring that is changing where decisions are made, how they are made, how you engage intelligence, how you engage labor. And basically, if you don't follow along, if you don't say there's something here that I might be able to use, you can very quickly find yourself in a place where your business is obsolete or not competitive. Basically, the answer to the first part, what is crowdsourcing? The answer is straightforward. It's something that will make your life miserable. No question. It's something that requires effort, requires you to work, to understand, and to manage it. But in fact, what it is a redeployment, as I said, of how we make decisions, of how we use human talent, of how we get people to do and accomplish things together. But fundamentally, it's changing structures. It's changing organizational structures. And that's what I'd like to probe with you today. How is it doing it? And I've chosen my type, crowdsourcing and monopoly capital, which is a generally Marxist way to do it, because Marx, as we know, is very much on the out and needs all the help he could get to be fashionable again. But also because it gives us a little bit of thinking of what is the relationship of work to money, and particularly skill to money. Now, there's a question which I have made my entire career upon of, is crowdsourcing new? And the answer is no. It's a fine division of labor, and we've had division of labor as long as we've had humankind, and we seem to be having noises beneath us. Let us hope the building is holding up. As long as we've had it. Adam Smith describes it in his very first chapter of On the Wealth of Nations. The first section, the first 3 chapters, are devoted to it. And he gets this idea of how divided labor works and what are the benefits and how it works. Now, in the process of doing that, we are using markets to do management of finely divided labor. And that is a bit of something new because it's something that technology has allowed us to do more cheaply and more inexpensively. But it's replacing rules and function and place with markets or variations of markets to do it. And there are a wide variety of ways we can do it. As I said, Adam Smith mentioned it in Wealth of Nations, Chapter 3, and you can very clearly see where he's going in an era that doesn't know the modern vertically oriented corporation. But Charles Babbage, who wrote 50 years afterwards, Chapter 22, you all know your Smith and your Babbage. This is like nothing. You're all going, oh yes, yes, Smith, yes, Chapter 3. I can picture it right now, the 3 basic, right. And of course, the mental division of labor, Chapter 22. You're supposed to just nod. Remember that. You're in business. A good bluff is worth an awful lot. He describes, and particularly he comes up with Babbage's rule, which is we generally would like to have one person who could do a complete job, start to finish. But we can't get all the skills for the price we're willing to pay in one person. And so how do you divide the work so that you get the exact amount of skill you need to get a job done? And presages much of what we have done. Now, there is a basic taxonomy of crowdsourcing, which I need to announce with absolutely no attempt at commercial success or gain on my part, can be found in a lovely new book entitled, sadly, Crowdsourcing for Dummies. This is nothing for the author's feeling for any of readers, because authors love readers. Crowdsourcing for Dummies has this taxonomy well-defined, clearly described, with beautiful illustrations on each. Basically, the issue is we're using a market, and you can divide up and put rules on the market 2 ways. One of the ways is how you reward people in the market. You can pay one person. This is the contest kind of model. Or you can pay everybody who comes to the market. Crowdsourcing uses both. The other way you can use it is you can use a market to force people to work together. Or you can use a market to force them to work on their own. So that is the coordination side and the payment side. A nice little 2x2 table ensues. I'm an academic. Academics love 2x2 tables. All the world is a 2x2 table. You can summarize everything in that 2x2 table about crowdsourcing, except for the fact that crowdfunding doesn't fall into that, and that's kind of a special thing. If you don't know what crowdfunding is, get a hat. Take it, turn it upside down, pass it to your friends. That is crowdfunding. Now take that process and put it on the web, and it's the exact same thing. All right, moving on. When you pay one person and the management is in complete control, saying you're working on your own, that's crowd contests, probably the most common and most familiar and most long-term successful of the crowdsourcing things. They have been associated with design schools since time immemorial, and you can find example after example in history about how this works. But when you say, okay, you're now paying everybody and still trying to coordinate it and keep them working by themselves, that's microtasking. That's dividing a job into little teeny tasks. I give it to you, you give me the results, you don't know who you work with, you don't care, you just do it. The job may take seconds, it may take days. It doesn't matter. Management is in charge. No matter how long it takes, that's a microtask. And we use the Amazon Mechanical Turk as an example. The Mechanical Turk, I need to warn you, I tend to ramble on into sort of culturally interesting but fairly useless tidbits of facts and knowledge. The Mechanical Turk is named after a fraudulent hoaxer, something made by a fraudulent hoaxer in the early 19th century, Baron von Clinton. You don't really care. But anyway, they chose the name and they have to live with it. Self-coordinated is when you put out something to the crowd and say, you figure it out. You work on it. And so this allows crowd members to work together and allows them at some level to choose their own. The first and most common of these is innovation crowdsourcing, and we've heard a lot of various things. Ideation, creating new products, developing things, the grand challenges, the Netflix contest. These are examples of innovation crowdsourcing. I've given the red balloon there for the famous DARPA Red Balloon Challenge of 2 years ago, now 3 years ago, which stuck out 10 red balloons and said, find them in the United States. David's reference to me being a crowd contest prize, there was a similar contest for finding fugitives. I joined the team that won the red balloon contest because I wanted to get the good tweets. And I found myself at the end of the day face to face with one of the fugitives in my neighborhood coffee shop. So I became a winner in that case and generated reams of publicity for people saying, he's an expert in this field and he's president of the IEEE Computer Society. Isn't this show that crowdsourcing's like completely rigged? And it surely did. The last one is macrotasks. We have said almost nothing about it. Odesk, ELAS. No, that's not true. UTest, Topcoder. Those are macrotasks where you've got bigger jobs. The person knows they have to fit into a bigger structure, sometimes with other members of the crowd, sometimes with an existing organization. As you work with crowdsourcing, it's important to know which of these you're working in because they have different management techniques, different strategies, different ways of working with the crowd. And if you think you're doing a contest and you're really doing macro tasks, you're going to screw up, and you're going to screw up big. And it'll be fun to watch, at least for me. And to avoid that, there's a lovely book you should buy called Crowdsourcing for Dummies. Again, no impartation is made about the reader. This is a view from my hotel room. I got up this morning and this is rain on the window, and I looked at this and I all of a sudden thought, oh my God, this is ground zero. If you go back in 1938, this was the view from my window. 2 buildings there where ground zero are is the Hudson Terminal building. In that building is one of the key players of crowdsourcing, the WPA scientific projects. This is a group called the Math Tables Project. They employed hundreds of people to do calculations by hand. They developed the fundamental techniques of management. And in the process, they discovered that market management, and this is their market right here, where they took tasks and put them on worksheets and hung them up there, allowed people to work at their own pace, do what they could contribute. And they did this for one reason, and one reason only. They had to put people back to work. And in doing that, they had to have some constraints. They couldn't compete with private business, who after all wanted to do mathematics by hand. It's painful, trust me. And second, they had to have a flexible mechanism because they wanted people to leave. We've heard a lot of comparison to our recent economic problems to the Great Depression. The Great Depression had 27% unemployment. In New York City, it went over 30 at times. So it's nothing of the same thing. Certainly not in scale. But they had perhaps a more willing and more able rural population able to absorb people back on farms. But they had to be flexible for changes in the economy, changes in season, and changes when people left. Some of these people could only work for a few weeks. Some of them were just doing enough to pay their rent. Some of them, fortunately for them, found jobs and were able to move on. This was the most flexible, simple way that they could do it. And at the time, only a government could afford this. The workers were paid 20 cents an hour, and that at the time was more than an ordinary organization could do it. And an ordinary organization couldn't afford the infrastructure that kept that market going. What has happened is we've changed the tools. Computing has given us communication techniques and ways of managing markets that have simplified that and taken the cost of market management, not down to zero, but close enough that it doesn't really matter to any of us. This is Mechanical Turk's hit screener, one of them. And it's something that now, when you think about planning, you don't have to worry about the market. You can choose to use Mechanical Turk, or any of the markets that have been shown here, and many that are not. And one of the problems, one of the challenges you will face, is finding the one that best meets your need. And going back to that taxonomy helps. But no matter which one you use, what's happening, and this is a picture of Ground Zero, not after 9/11, but as they're tearing down the Hudson Terminal building, thereby destroying a key landmark of human computation and crowdsourcing as a whole that at the time no one cared beans about. And I suspect no one cares beans about now. Just go down there and ask, did you know that this site was an important place in crowdsourcing? And I bet most everyone thinks it's more important for someone else, something else. One of the things that crowdsourcing has done, and that we have seen in its history, is this idea of, we hear called democratization. Jeff Howe called it deprofessionalization. It really is the decapitalization of skill, taking the linkage between skill and capital and splitting it apart. And the basic idea behind that is that when you have a skill, you need a large amount of capital to be able to employ it. And that relationship to that capital determines how you behave yourself, how you look for jobs, how you work, the environment in which you work, and how you can contribute to the economy. The modern crowdsourcing, which is post-internet, post-92, is really about setting up environments in which individuals can develop and use skills, contribute to the environment, to the economic environment, and not require large amounts of capital. Now, it may also mean that people with skills aren't necessarily guaranteed a chance to become rich fast. That's a different issue. But it does allow them to practice and contribute. The example that I find that's useful, that's not crowdsourcing, that helps you understand this splitting apart, is if you go to newspapers of 1950, the capital is the printing plant. And that's actually an older printing plant, but ignore that fact. I couldn't find one in my files that was any newer. That was owned by somebody, usually a family. Newspapers were notoriously owned by single families. The skill that we're looking at right now is a very simple one, that of being a reporter. And if you wanted to be a reporter, you had to be associated with someone who had capital and a printing plant, distribution network, and all of those things. This was tied to a regional market, and of course, capital had the decisive role. If you were the publisher, and this is something, and my brother's a journalist, so I revel in this example. The right to publish is not the same thing as the right to be published. The publisher has a great deal of power to decide what they can do and what they put out. The reporters, of course, have very little power. Capital had the power. Now, that capital, that power was held in balance by a variety of things. Advertisers, circulation, the reporting needs of an area. Basically, it was a regional thing that was held together by a bunch of different pieces. If you go to Marshall McLuhan's writings, he talks about newspapers as a media form, represents a family and a community. And it started falling out of balance before the internet. Advertisers went national because local department stores were bought into chains, and their advertising went national. Circulation went broader, beyond just what a bunch of 12-year-old boys could do on their bicycles. And that, again, pushed things out of line because the newspaper started to lose touch with community. That opened a different market that a local reporting staff could no longer cover, and you had people in different and distant cities. And as that happened, things started being pulled apart. And weather went out, sports went out, classified ads was a big one when Craigslist came in. And the traditional response to things like this is you fight to preserve the status and function of your workers. And in this case, the reporters have fought like mad to keep their status, their ability to express themselves, and their function, what they can do relative to that capital. And what's happening all the time, if they do that, is cutting costs and trying to say, well, if we just got some new readers in this market, if we just expanded here. It's not the fundamental work that needs to be done of restructuring the worker's status and function. Those are the two things well, two of three. Position, status, and function in an organization. And what you find in crowdsourcing as you use it, why it's going to make your life miserable, is that you have to start thinking about that in all your work processes and in everything you do. Because it will give people who didn't have the ability to function that ability, because they don't need to have a relation to capital. You can get them in bits and pieces as you need them. The status comes not from their relationship to you, but their success in the market. Their position is their reputation, what happens over the long term, and what they can demand for their work because of what they have done. A similar restructuring occurred with cash registers, and we don't think of this, because this shows it's not the technology, it's the system of using people. Cash registers are an 1880 technology. John Henry Patterson was one of the leaders, NCR's founders. And what he was really interested in is not selling technology, but opening new labor pools, expanding retail. Prior to cash registers, you had to have people who took money in your store to be trusted. The best ones to trust were, of course, daughters, because they are dependent upon the family unit. And they, of course, can attract poor men to you, who will then be dependent upon their daughter and hence you, especially if there's a male heir involved. That's like really cool. And you can control them as owner with your capital, because you know whence they came and whither they go. You hire a stranger off the street, bang, your money is gone. With the cash register, he sold systems that talked about who could ring on the cash register, who had a key to it, who could put stuff in, who could take it out, who could balance it. And that allowed store owners to radically expand who they could hire. And after you had cash registers, you start seeing the rise of department stores, you see the rise of chain stores, you see the rise of grocery stores that are not run by families, that can get more capital, that can offer more goods, that can expand into more places. And they could do it because this system expanded the labor pool. And that's what crowdsourcing is, a similar kind of activity. It expands a labor pool and allows also a job pool, allows you to get certain skills that you can't hire someone to do the whole time. But you can get pieces, and that will help your organization. There are things that you couldn't afford to do because they involve a lot of human work. The crowdsourcing lowers the cost because the market costs are down. But in the process, it changes the role. And right now, no family starts and holds their store by having their daughter, or if you're forced to, your son. Sons are perfectly good too, I suppose. But they don't, well, it's modern day and age. I suppose they could attract other no good young men into them, but we aren't going there. The point being, this restructured labor, and this allowed a major expansion. The assembly line allowed a major expansion of manufacturing. But the real thing that drove manufacturing was not the assembly line. It was the mechanization of farming. Because it released African Americans from the South and farm boys from the West who could come to the cities and support it. And without that mechanization, we would not have had the labor pool. And it's interesting that the two pieces are just marched side by side. Without the one, you can't have the other. Crowdsourcing offers the same kind of process. I can't begin to tell you what it's going to do, but it allows for more flexible organizations, organizations that can meet market demands. You've heard a lot about how these organizations respond to markets. And allows you to use skill that either you would gladly take a second rate. You know, you hire an accountant who can also do a little graphic design. And he's a nice person, and his designs aren't that ugly, and you can live with them. You now don't do anything less than top-rate design, because you can hire what you need. The fundamental idea behind this is what we're calling the CoA Thesis, Ronald Coase, the economist, who said that organizations, corporations were formed because they were able to do things more efficiently than markets, that management could put together an organization better than a market. In the 30s, that's true. At some level, that peaks in the mid-50s. And we start seeing things breaking apart and having subdivisions and wholly owned subsidiaries because that's more efficient. Crowdsourcing pushes it in another step. As we've heard, it's not for all things or for all people, but it's a force upon the organization. Now, that's my answer to the question. What is crowdsourcing? It's a way of using labor that involves market management. Has 4 basic forms, plus crowdfunding, which is lovely, but I don't care about. Although it is mentioned in this absolutely lovely book, Crowdsourcing for Dummies, which the term dummies is nothing to say about the readership. But what's happening to it, why you should care. It's a redeployment of talent. And it's a fairly radical redeployment of talent. It's not unlike what cash registers did, mechanization of farming, modern assembly line. And to be there at the start of that, which is where you all are, to be, this is 4 or 5 years old, is an opportunity to understand it, to write it, and to set the intellectual tone, the corporate and economic framework for what your peers and friends will be doing. To be there is glorious, wrote the poet, but to be young is to ascend the very heights of heaven. However, if you really want to know this, what's a good talk without a Wordsworth quote? That's my thing. Instead of dummies, this makes no imputations against the readers. When computers were human. And it argues through the same thing, that this has been a force that we have seen in economic life, I date it back to the 18th century. In fact, it's really 1880s forward. That moves skill, changes its relationship to capital, and allows people to make their own decisions, to shift the locus of control to where efficiency can occur, and give us new places, new positions, new status in the economy. And with that, I am indeed David Alan Grier.